Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report, I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue looking at the case of jailed State Department whistleblower Stephen Kim, we're joined by Peter Maas, a senior writer at The Intercept. His new article, just out today, is titled Destroyed by the Espionage Act. Stephen Kim spoke to a reporter. Now he's in jail. This is his story. Peter Maas, welcome back to Democracy Now! You've been on this story for a while now. You actually accompanied Stephen Kim on his journey to jail, where he sits right now. But let's go back, and you tell us the whole story. What happened to Stephen Kim? Who was he? How did he end up at the State Department?
Well, Stephen Kim was expert on North Korea. He worked at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is where the nuclear weapons in the American arsenal are designed and where they're analyzed. So he was privy when he was there to some of the kind of deepest, most sensitive secrets of all. And then he became an official at the State Department working as an expert on weapons of mass destruction, and particularly North Korea. And in 2009, he was introduced to James Rosen of Fox News by John Hertzberg, who was an official, actually a press official at the State Department. And they were introduced in order to talk. And they talked about all kinds of things, Pakistan, North Korea, etc.
Now, this is extremely important. Kim didn't reach out to Rosen. It was the State Department press person who got Kim in touch with Rosen. Is that right?
Exactly. And this is one of the, it's not an irony, it's one of the kind of tragedies of this case, is that Stephen Kim ended up being prosecuted by the FBI and the Department of Justice for talking to a reporter whom Kim had been introduced to by another arm of the government, that is, the State Department's press office. So,
and talk about where that first meeting took place. What did Hertzberg set up?
What Hertzberg set up was this kind of, very ordinary by Washington standards first meeting between a journalist and a State Department official. It took place outside of the State Department. And again, this is arranged by a State Department official because Hertzberg, as, a kind of savvy press official does, knew that it wouldn't be so good for this first meeting to take place in Kim's office. It was in a very sensitive area. Everybody would have to put away their classified documents, et cetera. Not so good to have them meet in the cafeteria, whatever other journalists and other people would see, et cetera. So Hertzberg arranged for them to go outside of the State Department and meet in a park right outside of the State Department.
Meet in a park?
Meet in a park right outside the State Department, which is what they did. And
and Hertzberg was with them.
And Hertzberg was with them, and Hertzberg introduced them. Stephen Kim, this is James Rosen. James Rosen, this is Stephen Kim. I think you guys have a lot to talk about. First meeting, 10 minutes. They just exchanged pleasantries, et cetera. Another, and again, irony isn't quite the right word with this, but later on, when Stephen Kim had this one conversation with James Rosen that is the subject of the Espionage Act prosecution, they left the State Department and talked outside of the State Department. And the FBI portrayed this fact, that they left the department in order to talk, as something very suspicious, that they were doing something that they weren't supposed to do, even though that precise act of leaving the State Department to talk is what they had done the very first time when they were introduced by a State Department official.
In fact, Stephen Kim was not used to speaking to reporters. He was asking the State Department for guidance on why he should be doing this.
Stephen Kim had very little experience dealing with reporters, basically had not talked to any American reporters, had talked to some Japanese reporters that had been brought into his office somewhat recently before this. He was interested, he told me, in talking to a reporter and asked for suggestions from Hertzberg, and Hertzberg suggested James Rosen. Kind of unusual for a State Department official, press official, to kind of first go perhaps to Fox News, which isn't loved in the State Department, which isn't loved in the Obama administration. But the bureau where Stephen Kim worked, which was in charge of basically making sure that arms control agreements were complied with, was kind of a redoubt of hardliners. And Hertzberg himself actually had donated to the Bush-Cheney campaign, et cetera, so he had some sympathies and had a friendship with Rosen. And so the decision was made, Rosen would be the person that Kim would be introduced to, and that decision was made by Hertzberg.
And so take it from there. What happened next?
That was in the spring of 2009, and they continued talking on their own without Hertzberg or anybody around. And then on June 11, 2009, Rosen calls Stephen Kim, calls him a number of times. And then they leave the State Department building once in the morning, and they go out and talk, and then they come back in. And then Stephen Kim looks back at his office at a new classified government report on North Korea. And then they go back outside again, Kim and Rosen having arranged to do so. And they talk for maybe it was 15 minutes, something like that. Kim goes back into the office. 3 hours later, approximately, Rosen publishes a story on the Fox News website that says, according to a new classified report, North Korea, U.S. government report, North Korea is planning in response to United Nations sanctions to detonate another nuclear weapon, et cetera, et cetera. And that report, the classified report that Rosen's story was based on, and Rosen's story itself, is the subject of the Espionage Act prosecution, because the government contended that this was classified information, harmful to national security, and Stephen Kim leaked it to James Rosen. The curious thing about this whole prosecution is, A, no document ever changed hands. The government never accused him of actually providing a document. It was just a discussion about a document. And then one of the things that I found out in the course of reporting this story, going through, for example, this very kind of lengthy court docket that a lot of people hadn't looked at, is that the FBI interviewed government officials about what happened and about the report. And one of these government officials told the FBI, this classified report that they talked about, it's a nothing burger. That was the phrase that was used, a nothing burger. This is what an official told.
A nothing burger.
And another official said about the Rosen story, about this nothing burger of a classified report, said that the report, Rosen's report, was nothing extraordinary. So the government even had people that it interviewed inside the government who were saying, look, this report wasn't a big deal. Now, of course, there were people in the government who thought it was a big deal. The biggest problem for Kim, though, I think, and this kind of came out in the course of the reporting, was that his timing was terrible, because he talked to Rosen at a time when the Obama administration had pretty much had it with leaks and had decided, unlike previous administrations and all administrations, they don't like leaks, unauthorized leaks. Official leaks, that's fine. They help the administration. It's for PR purposes. Unofficial ones they don't control, they hate. The Obama administration, in contrast to the ones that preceded it, decided to use the Espionage Act to prosecute people who leaked, who talked without authorization to reporters. And Stephen Kim happened to be a person who talked to a reporter without authorization about a subject that the government did not find very flattering.
Well, he had original authorization.
Well, he had original authorization to talk with Rosen, exactly. There wasn't explicit authorization for him to go out and talk to Rosen about this particular report. So that was kind of a slight distinction there. But his timing was terrible, because that story, the Rosen story, came out just at the moment when the Obama administration, when Dennis Blair, who's head of national intelligence, was looking it over and saying, we've got to stop this. We have to prosecute people. We need to, as Blair told the New York Times later on, hang an admiral, make an example of somebody. And Stephen Kim popped up onto the radar screen right then. It was very unfortunate for him that Rosen, unfortunately, had not been terribly careful in his contacts with Kim. So, for example, when the government decided, like, okay, we're going to investigate this leak, it was very easy for them to figure out where Rosen got it from, because Rosen had used his phone at the State Department, he was the State Department reporter then, to call Stephen Kim several times that day. He had used his cell phone to call Stephen Kim several times that day. They left the building at the same time. They returned it basically the same time. So for the FBI, you don't have to be a very good FBI agent to figure out very quickly who James Rosen talked to, who had access to that report. And they zeroed in on Stephen Kim quite immediately. And then they found a series of emails that Rosen had sent to Stephen Kim, asking Kim for internal documents from the State Department. Case closed. I mean, not case closed, but that for the government was the entire case, basically.
We're talking to Peter Maas, an award-winning investigative journalist, author, and senior writer at The Intercept, who's just published a major report headlined "Destroyed by the Espionage Act." Stephen Kim spoke to a reporter. Now he's in jail. This is his story. So let's take it from there. Talk about how Stephen Kim was first approached by the FBI, questioned, and what happened next.
This is one of the many surprising things. The FBI came to him in the State Department office, and they told him they were there to talk about an investigation. Stephen Kim did not know what the investigation was, and they asked him a lot of questions, and some of the questions were about the story that Rosen had reported. They didn't tell him that he was the target of the leak investigation. He didn't know at the time, when he was first talking with the FBI, that he was the target. They did not tell him that. And that was, in some ways, what at least Stephen Kim's lawyer refers to as kind of a perjury trap. Not in those precise words, but basically that.
This is Abbe Lowell, who is a well-known attorney who even represented President Clinton. President
Clinton during his impeachment hearings, exactly. He regards it as something close to a perjury trap, wherein the FBI, and this is something the FBI has done and law enforcement does quite frequently, they go to suspects, interview them very casually, don't tell the suspects, you're actually the target of our investigation. And they get the suspects sometimes to not tell the entire truth, because the suspects don't know that they're under investigation, that it's a big deal, et cetera. And so Stephen Kim, when the FBI first came to him, didn't tell the entire truth. He said, well, I've only met James Rosen once. I won't talk to him about anything else, and I never talked to him again, which was not true. If he had known that he was the target of an investigation, he would have probably lawyered up, and he would probably been very careful about what he said. When the FBI came to him the second time, which was about 9 months later, then they kind of laid down everything they had. They said, "You've broken the Espionage Act. There's a body of work," is the phrase that they used, according to Stephen Kim. They threatened him with multiple counts of the Espionage Act. And this was in August of 2010 that he was finally indicted under one count of the Espionage Act and one count of lying to the FBI. That was 2010. He decided to fight against the government. And for 4 years, he fought. And he got Abby Lowell, who's a very good but very expensive lawyer, to take his case on. It cost millions of dollars, only part of which actually Stephen Kim could afford to pay. And it took everything out of him. And this is one of the things that to me was, I guess it's not surprising because we've seen this happen, but when the U.S. government goes after somebody and goes after somebody in what the government considers a high priority case, it has virtually unlimited resources. And the effect that this had on Stephen Kim was to deplete his life savings, deplete his family's life savings. His marriage broke up. His young son had to move away. He contemplated suicide, and he talked to me about this. You know, when you're kind of accused of basically of espionage, which is what the name of the act is, your entire reputation is shot even before you have the first chance to stand up in a court and say, "I'm innocent, and this is why." And he Googled how many sleeping pills it would take to kill himself. He thought of jumping in front of a train, not because he was guilty, but because he was innocent and didn't feel that he would be able to get a fair trial, that he would end up spending many years of his life in jail.
And so then explain what happened, how this was, if you could call it, resolved.
Well, basically, not long before the trial was scheduled to start, the government made an offer to Stephen Kim's lawyers, which was that he would have to spend a slightly modest amount of time in jail, and it ended up being 13 months. Plead guilty to the Espionage Act violation.
This was after they had said he was threatened with 30 years, then he should serve 7 years to a plea agreement, and now it's down to 13 months.
Exactly. And this is, I mean, this is, you know, often a process where the government kind of threatens to throw the book at somebody unless they plead guilty, and it creates an enormous amount of pressure. And Stephen Kim compared himself, or didn't compare himself, but said that he really understood, for example, what happened to Aaron Swartz. Aaron Swartz being a brilliant computer programmer who was accused after having downloaded academic articles from a commercial database, accused of computer crimes that would have landed him in jail, the government was saying, for, I think, more than a decade or something like that. And it was a terrible burden for Aaron Swartz to take, and he ended up taking his own life. Stephen Kim came very close himself to that. The government doesn't only crack down on leakers and whistleblowers, it cracks down really on, very strongly on anybody who disseminates data beyond the borders that the government deems appropriate, whether it's corporate or government data. And so for Stephen Kim, it became a kind of, he described it to me as like a brutal calculus. Okay, if I plead guilty and get 13 months in jail, that's it. I'll be out maybe after good behavior after 11 months. If I take this to trial, if I go to trial, I could end up in jail for 12 years. It'll be another $1 million in legal fees that I don't have the money to pay for. Which is the better route to go? And he took the route of pleading guilty and taking the 13-month sentence.
And what happened to James Rosen, the Fox reporter?
He is a very well-known Fox reporter still.
He was under investigation.
Yeah, well, James Rosen, and this is one of the aspects of the case that got actually more attention than what happened to Stephen Kim, is what happened to James Rosen, which is the government, in order to acquire emails, James Rosen's emails, more than they actually already had, they applied for a search warrant. And in the search warrant, they referred to Rosen as a potential co-conspirator in violating the Espionage Act. They accused him of basically kind of being this minstrel who was trying to operate a spy ring with Stephen Kim, collecting data, and maybe unnamed other people collecting data. Rosen came that close to being indicted himself. When this was revealed that the government, A, called him an unindicted co-conspirator, and B, got his cell phone records, got his emails, tracked his physical movements. When this was finally revealed, and this came out in 2013, it was a huge controversy in the press because it was taken legitimately so as an attack on the freedom of the press.
You had James Rosen at Fox and James Risen at the New York Times.
Yes, it can get confusing at times. Very different stories and very different journalists, but there was something very similar in both of their cases, which is that the force of the government was brought to bear on journalists in order to connect them to crimes or get them to talk about alleged crimes.
And meanwhile, Stephen Kim continues to serve this 13 months in jail in Cumberland, Maryland.
He is in jail.
That does it for the show. Peter Maas, award-winning investigative journalist, will link to his piece at The Intercept called Destroyed by the Espionage Act. Stephen Kim spoke to a reporter. Now he's in jail. This is his story. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much.